So the first thing you have to realize about Miami, Florida, much of South Florida actually, is that it's a manufactured landscape, right? It is a city that was almost terraformed into existence at the turn of the century and in the 1950s and 60s through gigantic swamp drainage projects. If you'd come here 150 years ago, all you'd have seen was the Everglades. But today, you have a metropolis of almost 9 million people in 3 counties. But because the way that system was built didn't take into account the possibilities of rising sea levels, stronger hurricanes, and stronger rains due to human interventions into the atmosphere by pumping more and more CO2 into it, the city isn't designed to deal with climate change. And it exists on a porous limestone subsoil, so it's not like Holland where you can just build dikes and ditches to manage the water, right? Here the water comes up from underneath you. If I dug down a couple feet, I'd hit water right here. So in Miami, what you're gonna see, and what you're already seeing, is a first world metropolis that is incredibly sensitive to the effects of human interventions in the climate, right? We've pumped tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, ice sheets are melting, the oceans are thermally expanding, they're becoming more acidic, the rains are getting harder, the storms are getting stronger. And we here on the tip of the Florida Peninsula on its southeast are gonna feel the brunt of those effects because of our inability geophysically to adapt very quickly. So if you're flying into Miami and you're looking down at the city from 35,000 feet and you're thinking, wow, this looks beautiful. Sunshine, more than 300 days a year. Maybe I should buy some property here, right? Well, you might want to think about the life of your investment, all right? So that's Miami, and this is the problem, right? The problem is essentially that you've got a large city with a lot of people in it, and it's very, very unequal. You've got a lot of rich folks, and you have a lot more poor folks. And as the waters rise, both the rich and poor are going to be displaced. It's about maybe 200,000 people that could get displaced here, probably more, maybe 300,000, with just 3 to 4 feet of sea level rise. And we're very much expected to get that by the middle of the century. So if you can imagine, how does a city cope with that? And the real answer is that we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to plan, but there's not a lot we can do to stop the water rising. Here's the thing, the water is kind of already here, right? Over the past 15 years, we've seen a 400% increase in sunny day flooding in terms of just like, it's a beautiful day outside, but because of a high tide, you know, the water is literally ankle deep in the city. But the question is a really good one because the first thing that people ask me when I tell them that Miami is threatened by climate change is like, well, all right, bub, how long do I have? When do I have to get out of Dodge? Okay? And the true answer to that is that we don't know. And you're like, wait, what do you mean we don't know? I thought we knew that climate change was happening. Well, yes, climate change is happening. We know by looking at the geological record and by applying the basic principles of physics that if you pump enough CO2 into the atmosphere, the ice caps will melt and the temperature will get hotter. We know that because it's happened before. But we are pumping so much CO2 so quickly into the atmosphere that that experiment has never been reproduced in the history of the Earth, right? At no other point in the geological timeline have we been able to observe this much CO2 entering this atmosphere this quickly, which means that we're in uncharted territory. We don't know how quickly the ice caps will collapse because we don't understand the physics of ice caps melting, right? It's not like we can look at a glass of water and figure out how the ice melts and apply that to the Greenland ice sheet, which if it melts, that's it. Goodbye, East Coast, right? So the physics of this are really hard. Science isn't funded enough. And, well, there's no good answer to when the water is going to show up. We just know it will be here. It's a little bit like a Dominican birthday party, okay? You invite people and you say, show up at 7, and they can show up between 9:30 at night and 1 o'clock in the morning, but the party's going to go till dawn. you know, today, if you don't live in a place like Miami, if you live in a place where the water doesn't necessarily show up, and you look at a climate projection that, you know, for instance, the International Panel on Climate Change says, okay, 4 to 6 feet by 2100. You're like, all right, dude, whatever. I live at 200 feet above sea level. Well, that's fine. But it's not just sea level rise, okay? It's the rains, right? As the atmosphere gets hotter, the space between the molecules is bigger. That means there's more water that the atmosphere can hold, and the rains become less constant, but much more intense. So can your property handle the drainage? Can the dam upstream from you handle, you know, a once in 10,000 year flood that's going to start happening every 50 years, every 20 years, right? Are your systems built to the new climate normal? And the answer to these questions is universally, oh, I hadn't thought about that, right? And it's not just the rains, it's also the temperatures. There's a lot of good science right now that projects how atmospheric temperatures are going to increase in different areas of the globe. And you're actually looking at large parts of Central Asia becoming, during chunks of the year, physically uninhabitable to human beings, right? Like it's too hot. So you may be hundreds of miles from the ocean, right? But where's your water coming from? Are you going to be able to cool your family? Or are the humans in your area going to be able to, I don't know, hang out outside enough to get all that they need to done when it is literally 50 degrees Celsius for 6 months of the year? So climate change isn't just about sea level rise. It's about a host of destabilizing atmospheric changes that add stress onto human societies. And listen, you know as well as I do, human society is pretty stressful enough as it is, right? People are assholes. Now imagine they're going to be assholes on climate change. There's going to be more inequality, and they're not going to be as nice because resources are going to be less available. So this is the future that we're building for ourselves unless we take the prescribed steps to change it. The United States is a little weird, and Florida is arguably the weirdest part of the United States. And South Florida, Southeast Florida, is weird in its own way. But one of the weird things that we do here is that we fund most of our government services, the trash, the police, the firefighters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, with property taxes. I don't pay the state of Florida or Miami-Dade County any money on the income that I make. I pay them instead a percentage of the property value of my owned property every single year. That has incredible downstream effects for when you're trying to adapt a city to climate change. First and foremost, it means that the city is a growth machine because it makes more money from development because of that property tax and because of extra taxes put on large-scale developments than most other industrial activities. So you have a city council where there's a feedback between developers and politicians, because the politicians are looking for revenue and the developers, well, they're looking for revenue too. So Miami is built as this growth machine, and we've built tons and tons of condos over the past 20 years, luxury condos, because there's a tax on that and that brings in a lot of money to the city, and because there's a big spread and a developer can make a lot of money on a luxury property, more money than they could make on a property built for people in different socioeconomic income brackets. That becomes an issue when you're trying to figure out what interventions to make into a city to make it more durable to climate change. Where do you put your pump? Where do you put your seawall? Where do you elevate the road? Most people, when they start figuring this out, use a system of thinking called cost-benefit analysis, right? And you look at an area and you say, okay, we make $200 million in taxes a year from this area. It's going to cost us half that to put in a pump. Cost benefit analysis, let's put in the pump. So what have you done? You've put in a pump in a wealthy area where you're making a lot of money off of it. And that area becomes defensible. But what about the areas where you don't make a lot of money? The neighborhoods where everyday folks live, right? The cost benefit analysis to seriously adapt those neighborhoods to rising sea levels, or to keep, in Miami's particular case, rich people from moving from the lower lying neighborhoods to the higher neighborhoods where lower socioeconomically advantaged people live in this town, farther away from the ocean. That incentive isn't there for city politicians, often. So what you end up with is a way of adapting a city that actually increases inequality rather than decreases inequality. And that increased inequality can, in turn, make it much more difficult to function in the future, right? Because this is a city that runs off of a service industry. You have to have people working in the hotels. You have to have construction workers. And if those service sector workers, if those construction workers live too far away or can't make a living here, well, what are they going to be able to do? They're going to move away. Here in Miami, we face the inevitability of rising water, right? We lose something like 10% of our land area with just another foot of sea level rise. We're going to lose 20 with 2 feet. And there's a tipping point at 3 to 4 feet where something like 300,000 to 450,000 individuals have to move away. But one of the big issues is that most of Miami's priciest real estate is right on the water. Because what? You're going to move to Miami and not have a beachfront mansion? What's the point? So if the ocean rises on your beachfront mansion and you don't feel like adapting it and you just let it go, that's going to decrease the property value, which is in turn going to decrease how much money the city makes. Because remember, most of the time, municipal governments here in South Florida don't have any other taxes other than taxes on property and maybe some taxes on businesses and hotels. So climate change poses a threat not just to the physical infrastructure and not just to the social relationships here in the city, but also a very, very real threat to the income streams of municipal governments across Florida. And if you think about it, eventually, if you want to sustain a city here, you have to move away from property taxes as your main way of funding it. There is no way where you're going to lose your most valuable properties, 10, 20% of your land area, your multi-million-dollar oceanfront mansions, where you get most of your tax revenue, and keep looking to property tax as the main way of funding this place. We're going to have to go to some other kind of blended tax system. And that's a whole nother discussion based on economics, equity, and justice, and who should get taxed and why they live here. Humans have figured out a way to account for risk, right? Risk is the possibility of something bad happening. And that way of accounting for risk is insurance. I will pay you a little bit of money every year. And if a lot of people are paying you that little bit of money every year, if something bad happens to one of those people, you turn around and pay them out so they can afford it. That's basically the concept of insurance and risk. But in order to spur development in low-lying coastal areas in the late 1960s and early 1970s, an American president named Lyndon B. Johnson, as part of his Great Society program, established the National Flood Insurance Program. The National Flood Insurance Program is essentially a government-run insurance corporation that puts out insurance for coastal areas. Here in Miami, it may cost you anywhere between, $500 to $1,200 a year to insure your coastal property against flood damages. Windstorm is a whole nother matter. The issue with the National Flood Insurance Program is that for 3 generations, its prices have not reflected the true risk of floodwaters here. that means that it's not an actuarially sound reflection of the possibility of a giant storm surge washing through the city and destroying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of property and causing that much damage, which means that the risk here is undervalued. But because it's a government program, there's no way for it to no way for other people to compete with it on a residential level, so you don't have a free market, right? And it creates a perverse incentive to keep investing here. And it also creates the possibility that should that program ever be altered, should that program ever go bankrupt and Congress not be able to fund it, or should there be a large enough storm where the NFIP just can't pay out, right? All of a sudden, who's going to be held accountable for that loss, for that damage? The South Florida homeowner. So in truth, the insurance here is super cheap, but really you're underinsured. And if there were a private market for residential flood insurance, yes, it would be much more expensive, but the development here would look very different, and perhaps people might actually receive some sort of true payout if the worst were to happen. It depends on who you're talking to, right? There's good polling data to suggest that large pluralities of Southeast Floridians understand that climate change is bad and that they're concerned about it. But there isn't good data to show that they understand necessarily what exactly climate change is going to do to their city, to their homes, and to their pocketbooks. Because let's face it, this is a city where within my lifetime, if you plunk down wealth here, there's a very good chance that that wealth will be destroyed by climate change. So do people understand that their home in Little Havana is going to be worth substantially less in 20 years than it was when they bought it? Probably not. What happens when they do understand that? Well, that's a whole nother question. The best way to address this question is to ask if Miami can be saved, right? If this city that American civilization has built on the southeastern tip of the Florida Peninsula that 150 years ago was swamp, will 150 years from now be anything but swamp? And there is a narrow path to survival. And that narrow path to survival involves the most judicious and quick path to decarbonization, right? So you have to look at it globally, and then we'll get locally. Globally, we're pumping about 36 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. That has to stop. All right? You got to decarbonize. You got to figure out how to get from point A to point B without putting CO2 into the atmosphere. You got to figure out how to turn the lights on without putting CO2 into the atmosphere. You got to figure out how to eat meat and plant crops and change your land use practices in such a way where you capture carbon instead of emitting carbon. Now, if, and this is a big if, the federal government gets its act together and institutes programs which reduce America's carbon emissions to the point where we can bend the curve of CO2 emissions, Miami stands a fighting chance. That's the macro level. At the state level, right, the state of Florida has to get its act together. Because it isn't just Miami that's threatened, it's Tampa, it's the Space Coast, it's stuff in the Panhandle. There's a lot of metro areas that are very low-lying and have similar topography and geophysics to Miami, or geology to Miami. Children. So the state of Florida has to start planning for this thoroughly. There was a little bit of effort at the beginning of the DeSantis administration, but that's sort of kind of gone away with the pandemic. And what do I mean by planning for this thoroughly? We have to change our energy mix. Here in Florida, we get most of our energy from natural gas, right? Natural gas is basically methane. It is a hydrocarbon that when you burn it, creates CO2. We have to start getting our energy from renewable sources. It's the Sunshine State. There is no excuse why solar should not be a booming industry providing hundreds of thousands of jobs for currently unemployed Floridians here in South Florida or in the rest of the state. But that's at the state level, right? You have to have changes in energy policy. You have to have changes in development policy, where you can build, where you can't build. You got to change the insurance. And that lets you start thinking about the interventions that you're going to make at the county and the city level. And counties and cities are essentially growth machines, right? They are ways of extracting value from land, fundamentally, right? In the ways of bringing people to an area and extracting value from those people. And what the growth machines here in South Florida have to figure out to do is, how do you create value while you're losing land, right? So we have to change development codes. We have to change master planning documents. We have to figure out a way for people to responsibly abandon pieces of property that they may own but are now valueless, and return those to nature. And we got to figure out how to make money off of this. So essentially, we have to figure out how to grow backwards and grow green, right? And that's something that in Miami, if we do figure it out, holds net benefits, right? Because it's not like the beaches that we have now are going to be around in 20 to 30 years. I mean, okay, fine, we could bring in sand from the Bahamas, but, right? So as sea level rises, we're going to lose our main industries here, which are tourism and hospitality and real estate. So we have to figure out how to innovate. And the narrow path to survival in Miami, Florida, involves figuring out how to innovate that green growth, right? And how to export it to the rest of the world. And that's how we generate industries here that make this place worthy of saving. Okay, so that's what we should be doing to walk the narrow path. Here's what we aren't doing, and what is actually being done. And this is why my book is called Disposable City, because right now we're treating this city like a piece of single-use plastic. At the municipal level, you have what are called resilience initiatives, efforts to help cities deal with the shocks and the stresses of climate change. They're somewhat effective, right? At times they can perhaps exacerbate inequality if they're not planned correctly. But ultimately they can, give a new lease on life to certain areas of the city for X amount of time, depending on how much money you put in there. But that's like giving somebody a Band-Aid for a gunshot wound, right? At the municipal level, you can green your city fleets, you can put in pumps, you can do X, Y, Z. But if at the state level the energy mix isn't changed and the development practices aren't changed, that means that Florida is still going to be emitting all that CO2 into the atmosphere, and the oceans are still going to keep on rising, and the temperature is going to keep on rising. And if nationally there is not a consensus reached on decarbonization quickly, right? Something akin to a Green New Deal, the chances of Miami surviving become slimmer and slimmer and slimmer, and the conversation becomes not, can Miami walk the narrow path, but how do we responsibly abandon the city? My response is the following to the very astute point that this is a tragedy of the commons, and that we could switch from natural gas in Florida, which is the world's 17th largest climate emitter. Okay, let's put Florida into perspective. There's 21 million people here. We emit as much CO2 every year as Turkey, which is 60 million. All right, but we could switch to green electricity generation tomorrow, and it wouldn't make a dent in the worldwide issue of CO2 in the atmosphere. And to which I say, okay, cool, good point. But if Florida switches, and Texas switches, and then Turkey switches, and then Indonesia switches, right? It doesn't happen day to day to day, but it can happen. And just in the same way that everybody wearing their masks can reduce the transmission of the coronavirus by up to 70% in a given area, everybody switching to carbon-free methods of electricity generation across the world can definitely have an impact. And even if everybody doesn't do it, even if just the larger economies do it, you get net benefits, right? Between China and the United States, that's a major chunk of global carbon emissions. Imagine if we had a 1950s, 1960s space race, but to decarbonize between China and the United States, right? Imagine framing it that way for Tom Cotton in the Senate, right? This is how you beat China. You decarbonize first. Okay, so this is a very, so the question is Miami and real estate. I would say that we're filming this right now in the backyard of a property that I bought while writing this book. All right, and you're like, wait, Mario, you bought a house in Miami while writing a book about how Miami is going to be screwed. And my answer is yes. If you understand the physics of what's going to happen here, there are ways to mitigate your risk, right? But you have to go beyond just mitigating your risk. You can't just buy on the high ground. You can't just make sure that the property that you have is on sewer and not septic, right? You have to make sure that you're buying on the high ground responsibly because of the way that Miami was built. Miami segregated its minorities onto the high ground in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? We had Jim Crow here. There was a literal wall between white and black neighborhoods. It was apartheid. And if you're just going into historically black neighborhoods and buying on the high ground, all you're doing is being a colonizer. So you need to figure out how to buy on the high ground here without displacing lower income folks, because that's ultimately going to lead to another kind of destruction that awaits your city. There's a lot more high ground in the south of the city that wasn't redlined than there is on the north. You just have to understand that the development designs there are different. So you can mitigate your risk responsibly by buying on the high ground, buying something that's attached to sewer and doesn't have a septic tank, and making sure that you don't displace a historically redlined minority group. Even with all that, right, you need to understand that you're holding onto an asset that may possibly depreciate as you own it for its lifespan, okay? Which means that, at least with me, I purchased an asset that generates a yearly cash flow through rental. I don't just live here, I also rent out portions of it, right? And so that allows me to make a yearly return on that investment, which offsets any possible depreciation. Sorry. People with loud cars in this city. That's one thing I won't miss when it's gone. Anyways, if it's an asset that generates a yearly cash flow, you can use that to offset the depreciation. And that's what I'm sort of doing here. But I also have an exit plan, right? Like I'm looking around and I'm making sure that, and I'm fighting like hell for the interventions that will make my city livable. And that's how I live with this purchase, right? That's why I wrote this book. But if those interventions don't occur, I have no moral qualms about placing this house on the market and moving away. My recommendation is for bloody rebellion. No, I'm kidding. My recommendation is for holding your politicians accountable. And this is like the most boring thing that I could say. But barring bloody rebellion and civil strife, your next best option is to start showing up to your city council meetings and raising hell. So figure out who your city commissioner is. Figure out who your state representative is. Figure out who your state senator is. Write them letters. Call them. Bother them. Show up to their offices. Show up to the meetings. More importantly than just showing up to the meetings, though, figure out in the cities how decisions get made. For instance, here in Miami, we have lots of little councils that are appended to municipal governments like the arms of an octopus, right? You've got the Planning and Zoning Board. You've got the Citizens Parks Review Board, right? All that kind of stuff. Start showing up. Nobody shows up to those boards. Show up. Ask questions. Ruffle some feathers, right? In addition to that, you've got to register to vote, and you've got to pick candidates who've got a good plan for climate and who aren't in the thrall of the fossil fuel industry. And that's going to take a little bit of research, and that's going to take you becoming active in your democracy. Democracy is still possible, even though we've kind of endured 4 years of minoritarian party rule. So yeah, the real answer here is activism, joining organizations that are engaged in this activism, donating, becoming democratically active as a citizen, and if all else fails, there's always the guillotine for the oil company executives. Listen, I'm an optimist, okay? And I wrote this book because I want to have my 80th birthday in the city that I love, Miami, Florida. And I'm going to hold my politicians to account. I'm going to organize, and I'm going to write good journalism about this topic. And that's what I'm doing. I'm doing my part. I need you to do your part so I can have my 80th birthday here. But if I don't keep fighting and you don't start fighting, I don't get to have my 80th birthday here. And it's that simple, right? I would probably have my 80th birthday in your town. And I'm really loud. And Dominicans are really loud, and we party, and the music just goes on into the morning. So I'm saying, if you don't want me to keep you up all night with my 80th birthday party, with bachata and merengue and salsa, help me fight climate change.